So I want to talk to you today about a couple of things that you've probably never thought to connect before. A little meteorology and a little history. In our world, there are forces of nature, and they run on laws. But unfortunately, every once in a while, these laws don't work quite right, and the results are less than wonderful. For example, you and I know that hot air rises, and colder air is more dense and it wants to be on the bottom. But every once in a while, that doesn't quite work that way, and for whatever reason that I'm not being a meteorologist can't explain to you, but a pocket of hot air will push up cold air. And so here's this really heavy mass of air, and of course we think, well, it doesn't weigh much, but it does, especially large amounts of it. And so what the cold air does is it decides that it looks for a weakness in this pocket of hot air, and it's going to exploit that weakness, and it's going to get back to where God created it to be. And the result is what we call a tornado, and this all of this cold air sitting up there just kind of drills its way down in this one weak spot with great catastrophe, great force. It's violent, and until it resumes equilibrium, it makes a mess and it kills other people, and those who it doesn't kill are left to pick up the pieces. I want to go back in time because I know you're thinking you know where I'm going, and I'll get there eventually. I'm not quite going where you want, but I want to go back in time to a place where things were out of order. And in the late 1700s, pun intended, revolution was all the rage. The United States had just had theirs, and we turned around and we were going to help France get theirs. Now, the two revolutions were quite different, but France had a particular revolution. In academia, theirs is the one that everyone likes to talk about, the subject, or at least involved in Les Miserables, surrounding the French Revolution, and it's romanticized. However, it didn't produce a revolution which lasted, even though it's the one that everyone seems to talk about a lot. Our own revolution produced something which lasted, and I think there's a reason for it, and it has to do with what their revolution was built on. While certainly they had a legitimate gripe in the way that poor people were being treated and various things, the problem is that Satan tends to use a little bit of good. He masquerades, the Bible says, as an angel of light. He tends to take some good, but to put his own agendas in things. And so the French Enlightenment was built on a hatred of God. And so buried underneath this revolution against the king, and as Maximilian Robespierre sweeps to power, calling himself, he had a nickname, and I can't remember, but it had to do with not being corruptible. I think his nickname was the Incorruptible, Max the Incorruptible. But he was quite corruptible, and his revolution was called the Reign of Terror. It didn't last that long. As I said, the French Revolution was very short-lived because it was out of order. It elevated man to a position where he didn't belong. It elevated him high above God, and it had to seek equilibrium. Man cannot exist on that level, and so eventually, after killing hundreds and hundreds of Christian people on the guillotine. Napoleon came to power, and Max lost his head on his own guillotine. And it was violent, and there were many innocent people who lost their lives because people had an out-of-order idea of who they were and subjected God. And that's the real subjection that I want to talk about. I know that as we started this, you might have thought I was going to go somewhere else. And we are going to talk about that a little bit. Where man thinks he's more important than another man, and one group thinks they're more important than another group. We get that, but that can only come when man thinks that he's more important than God, and that's the real evil in all of this. So as I say, man seeks causes that seem good, but they often have an underlying cause that Satan is trying to implement, and he's working hard for. And he covers this up very cleverly, and we fall prey to it. Now, think about following the Civil War. Things, our progress towards racial equality was and has been one that was a journey, certainly not a moment in time. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't fix all evils. Black men still didn't have the right to vote for a number of years, I think 1870. It took black women another 95 years to be able to vote. That was the 15th Amendment in 1965. In between then, there was progress. In 1954, the United States finally figured out that it is not proper for one group of people to be able to go somewhere and another group of people not to be able to go. So segregation was no longer allowed in the United States. Now, it's something that's interesting between these dates, following the Civil War and up to 1965, with some exceptions, most of these advancements were gained peacefully. Martin Luther King especially was one who despised violent protest. No, maybe because it wasn't violent progress took longer. I don't know. But I do know that something happened, and it begins in 1965 with the Watts riots. Actually, it was the same exact week as the amendment to give women the right to vote. But something happened. Well, what happened? What was going on in the 60s was a different movement. And since then, most of our demonstrations have managed to turn violent, unlike what happened before then. We can, starting from there, and then again in 1968, the race riots in 1968, we have the Rodney King, if we want to flash forward a little while, and even what's gone on very recently, or even up in the last 10 years, throughout various parts of our country. Demonstrations have turned violent where they did not used to. What happened? Why was progress gained peacefully before? But there's something underneath that. The 60s were a time of change in our country, and John Lennon summed it up in his song, Imagine. It's considered to be one of the greatest rock and roll songs, or I guess songs by a rock and roll, not really a rock and roll song, but by a rock and roll performer. But in there, again, sounds nice piano melody, but in there is the statements. He says there's no religion. Imagine no religion. Imagine people living peacefully. And so in his mind, peace was going to be gained by elevating man above God. And that was really the mantra for the 60s. And it continued, and that is an entire generation built their ideology on that. And so for the last 50 years or so, man has been elevated above God. And every once in a while, there's these little funnel clouds where things seek their equilibrium. But still, that mass has not found its equilibrium fully. And maybe things getting worse and worse because of that. It's going to find a weakness eventually. Satan continues to put his own agenda in things. And he gives it enough truth to be appetizing even to Christians. Because we can understand things that are out of order and look wrong. And we want to correct those things. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, right towards the end of the chapter, it's the section from verse 12 through 17, and I'm not going to quote the whole thing. For one, I can't. But for the sake of time, in this Devo, I just want to, he says, God's going to test what you've built. And he's going to see what it's made of. Did you build with wood and straw and stubble and things that burn up? Or have you built with gold and precious stones and things that are considered to be more permanent? It's not that what you're building is bad, but it might not be permanent. We have a lot of causes in Christianity that we look at as noble. Racial equality is a noble thing to fight for. Abortion, and people demonstrate for that. All of these things are noble, but they aren't permanent. They aren't human souls that are going to go to heaven if we win that cause. We can win that cause, and it can be a good cause, but if we stopped abortion today, it wouldn't mean that a soul went to heaven. Actually, it would probably mean that souls didn't go to heaven. If you want to follow the logic out, that's a different Devo, but our cause as Christians is to be different from the world. We're called to be different. We're not called to fight those fights. We are separate from the world. And Satan throws enough of good in something to be palatable for us and appetizing to us, but it is a distraction. And what's worse is that a lot of the agendas in the things that people are fighting for today are not just not eternally productive, but they're eternally destructive. So many of the things are built on a humanism and an elevation of man beyond God and a tearing down of God. It's going to find its equilibrium, and it's going to be violent, as we've seen already. Godly things do not produce violence. It is only when man elevates himself and nature seeks to correct that things get violent. And so the evidence of violence is the evidence that Christians should not be involved in these things. So I want you to take time to examine the causes and the things that you're involved in before God examines it with fire. You can still, the 1 Corinthians chapter 3 is quite clear, you can still go to heaven having been involved in these causes. That's not what I'm suggesting. He says you can still go to heaven. You can escape that fire personally, but you will do so not having anything eternal to show for it. So I encourage you to examine that before God does.